Before we dive into this episode, most business owners we find struggle with time management, cash flow, and actually scaling their business. We really feel like we have to work this out on our own. This isn't really the case. We built Invizbiz, and this is a way that we can help you achieve those outcomes in your business for free. So check out the show notes below, click on the link, and see how we can help you through Invizbiz build and scale your business, which becomes your ideal business. Welcome to another episode of the Ideal Business Podcast. This is podcast number 100. God, so we thought about it as a team for a while, like what should the 100th episode be? And well, I don't know if we thought about it. Dante thought about it. So he bounced it around. And so as a team, we came up with a bit of an idea of talking a little bit around, because our whole thing about what we do is helping people create an ideal business. And a good question is your business ideal? Are we running an ideal business? Are we operating within what we would consider to be an ideal business? What does that look like as a business owner? What does that look like for the owners of the business, the team? What does that mean to be an ideal business? So what we thought we'd do is we'd bring in some of our key people in this particular episode, and we'll have some conversations around some different perspectives of what that looks like and what it means. So in today's call, we've got Liam James. He's our marketing director. He's going to, I don't know what Liam's going to talk about. He always talks about something. We've got Matt Radcliffe. He's our GM for Invizbiz. We've got Hazel, and she works with us doing copywriting. She's also working with us on sort of doing some stuff Southeast Asia. And we've got Dante Antonelli, who looks after all the PR side of the business and this type of activity. So welcome aboard, everyone. Nice to have
Pleasure
you
to be here
in this podcast.
Hello, exciting.
But I think what would be good is to maybe have a bit of a collective conversation around what this whole ideal business thing, if you're listening to this podcast, you might have listened to some other podcasts. What we sort of realized in a way is that it's not something that people have in their frame of thinking, oh, I'm going to build an ideal business. When you've got something that takes place, it's very easy to look at it and go, oh, this is great, but it would be better if it was more like this. So you can compare what's not working well and have some ideas around what it would look like to be better. But what is often missing is what is actually missing in this idea of how you build a business. And one of those things is the idea of building this, what we would consider to be an ideal business. People don't really think about it like that. And it's that whole idea that you just make money. If you make money, everything else takes care of itself, which is nonsense, really. It doesn't really work like that. So it is all about, freedom. It's all about lifetime enabling life goals, what you're trying to achieve, not just as a business owner, but also from your team's perspective. So maybe let's do a bit of a roundtable first. What does it actually mean for each of you guys? What does it mean when we talk about the ideal business? What does that mean? So if you're in a context of, if you had a paragraph and you said this is what it means, just like to hear it from you guys. What does that mean? Who wants to kick off? Maybe Liam.
I mean, the ideal business thing for me, and the way that it's always been, and why I latched onto it so hard when I first met Paul and got into working on this stuff, was there has to be a better way, because you've seen so many people go through it, and there's all this talk about hustle, 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 and it surely can't just be this one-sided story. So after I started working with Paul, it was a bit of an awakening to this idea that there is another way. There is another way to actually do this. And for me personally, what an ideal business is there's low time intensity, so that whatever I'm doing is highly leverageable. Whatever is going on in my business, it is something that I actually actively want to be doing, because I want to wake up and I want to be excited to go to work or work on a big project and have a sense of meaning. And I want to work on things that align with my values, that actually fulfill me from an internal perspective, not just the external perspective of money, of fancy cars, of whatever. In an ideal world, it's not a material result that I'm looking for in the end. It's more about the time, the freedom, and be able to live where I want to, when I want to, and work on what I want to when I want to as well. So it really wouldn't have to be, in terms of monetary value, too high at all. But it just needs to fit that bill where it's leverageable, where it gives me all of those freedoms.
So let me ask you a question. I think it's been over 5 years now you've been working. You've been involved, haven't it? Yeah, it's been over 5 years. So what's the changes that have, like the tangible changes that have sort of occurred in the way you work and the way you live and the way you exist, operating within a business with a different framework and a different sort of set of values, I guess. I guess it's a different set of values about what we see as important. What does that look like for you?
It's changed dramatically. So since I first began 5 years ago with you, my life was definitely very in one place, in one time. Didn't have a lot of flexibility to travel, to move, and so on. So the moment that I was able to work with Invizbiz in a very flexible arrangement, which you guys are one of the most interesting companies I've ever heard of or worked for. When I tell other people, hey, we're an outcomes-focused business, time is not really the thing that everyone's looking at, checking on. It's about getting the actual result. So like some weeks I get to finish, an extra day early because we did everything. Or some weeks I'm working 50 hours, and that's just part of this cycle. But for me, that gave me the flexibility of going, oh, wait a minute, there's another way to do things. So 2 years into working with Invizbiz, I was off. I was, living in a van in New Zealand, and the year after that, I was in Italy for 5 months. So there's been a lot of changes since that very early stage where I realized I could actually live in whatever way I would like to, and get to try those different things as well, which is an experience that I would have never had if I wasn't here. So yeah, it's definitely shifted a lot since the beginning.
So good shifting or bad shifting? What do you reckon?
I would say we're definitely continuing to move towards the ideal scene.
Yeah, right.
For sure, without a doubt.
Well, that's really good. It's great to see that perspective. Is there anything else from your perspective you in relation to what the ideal business is and how it sort of unfolds? Any other insights that you've sort of maybe they've become aware of that maybe weren't something that was in your line of sight previously?
For me, it was probably the awareness that you have more agency than you probably realize. And a lot of the suffering that we put ourselves through is self-imposed. Okay. Yeah. We build these prisons for ourselves. And in business is the same, whether that's, the emotional drawbacks of what that feels like when you're having a hard time. But a lot of that is you have done this to yourself, and you also have the agency to get yourself out of it. So it's a belief shift. Once you know that, okay, there is another path and there's another way, and if I execute on it, then we could actually have the things that I wanted on the other side of that bridge. But I think for me, it was that turning point of going, oh wow, there's actually just a new belief system that came on.
No, that's a really good observation. Thanks for that, Liam. Hazel, might be nice to hear from you. So maybe just tell us what you're about. How do you what you do with us here, and a little bit about your story. Interesting, obviously we've got a bit of a history going back now. So just maybe tell us a little bit about yourself first, as a bit of a terms of reference.
Yeah. So I am managing the content, or creating the written content for Invizbiz and Registered. I think, Paul, you found me when I was working for some group of business owners or something. But this is something I always tell the people that ask me how I met you. They're like, it's pretty fun, or it's pretty, how can you say this? It was Paul who found me. Like when you're a freelancer or service provider, you look for a client, you pitch them, then you start. It was somehow that you engaged me, and I think that felt pretty special because.
Oh, did I? I don't even remember.
Now you forgot, but it was you.
So how did that? But how did I come across you? I'm just trying to remember. How did I come across you?
I remember you said you saw me in the group in the Entourage.
I
was like, I was still working on copywriting for Jack DeLosa, and then you identified me there, found me there. So that was how it started. But then, and then, at first it was like, who are these people? And then it was it started like service provider relationship. But it was so pleasantly surprised the more that I got to know you and the rest of the team. Like, this is different. These aren't transactional type people. They're actually, the first thing that got my trust was the integrity, where you have these people with different brands online. They talk about how these are the things I value, these are my principles, and then behind the scenes, when you're their employee, you find out they're not actually
Not quite like that. Not quite like
actually no, like 4-hour work week, and then you find out all their employees are like working weekends 24/7, and filing a leave is frowned upon. And then all these things, like I would have a client who is in health, and then all the employees are getting sick because they're overworked. That's funny. Just no integrity at all. And then we're like, look at Paul, like he's actually, it's not a persona. In fact, he's just like living his life and just actually doing it. And that got my trust. And so also talking with Liam, the more Liam shared, stories with me, and then I dug deeper and discovered, so it's genuine, and I got attached to that. So yeah, that's how I stayed. Like right now, I'm in an existential crisis, like I told Liam, where I'm like exploring what to do next. But I didn't, I cut all of the clients that I have, but I stuck with Invizbiz because for some reason I'm not annoyed. I'm not annoyed talking with you guys and working with you guys, but all these other people, I'm like so annoyed by them. So yeah, that's me. So ideal business. What is the ideal business for me? This is also a concept that I discovered by working with you guys. So at first, I created and molded myself to be what media tells you a perfect employee or a perfect business owner should be. You gotta be tough, aggressive, assertive. You gotta be working all hours. You gotta be doing this and that. So that's, I created this. I told Liam about it. This mercenary type personality, where like
take no prisoners. Take no prisoners.
I offer myself to the highest bidder, and then I'm like, as long as you pay me, I'm good. And then I realized the more I worked on these projects and met all these people with no integrity, I couldn't really fuel myself with the money. I discovered that, it's not enough. I actually lose steam when it's something that I realize is a lie, something I don't believe in, and just done to get money. So it changed many things about me and how I, do business. And so anyway, the ideal business for me is something that can grow with you. It is custom to you. So when you're single, you can work 24/7 if you want to. When you're a parent, you want to adjust your business to accommodate the things in your life that need your time as well. And if you're in a not so ideal business, either fall apart, or you'll either feel guilty for saying, hey, I need to pick up my kid from school today, he's sick today, something like that. And I hate that guilt feeling. So the ideal business can accommodate and continue to work and grow, custom to you and your stage in life right now. So let's say you get sick as well, and now you can only work 3, 4, 5 hours a day, let's just say, because the next you're doing therapy or whatever. You have the control to mold your business or to hire someone to fill in those gaps. But if you don't have an ideal business, or if you're like an employee in a not so ideal business, you do not have that control, and so your life would be not so nice. So yeah, that's the ideal right now for me. Ideal business is custom to you. You can control and modify it to keep your life and source of income kind of working together. So it's not easy, but that is the goal. And I've seen it's possible. I've seen a real life behind the scenes vision of what it could be, and not just some, marketing schma that's out there. So yeah.
Yeah, no, that's really good. Some really good insights there, Hazel. Makes sense. So what have been some of the changes that you've sort of brought into play that, from your work, the way you operate in your work, which has positively impacted other parts of your life? What, and was there a bit of a mind? Did you really have to shift your mind a little bit? What was that like as you were trying to transition?
It's significant because in the beginning, it's all just money. How much money is this gonna make me? How much money I can make from this relationship or this project or whatever? And it didn't care. Like, there's some scam products out there, and I was in a group where some people would sell 1-minute prayers that can give you You can win the lottery, you can lose 11 pounds, you just have to recite this special prayer. And it's been hidden by the Vatican from you for all these years. So there's kinds of industries
Oh,
they
man.
make a lot of money because they exploit a human, weak emotional states in human beings. And so they really do make a lot of money. And so these are the things that I've, the circles that I've worked in. And in the beginning, I was like, just get your money, cash in and get out. So, but it kind of killed me slowly seeing
Right.
these things happen. And so I had to change it. It can't power me through the tough days.
Mm.
It has to be something I believe in, I realized. And so right now I'm like, I clean up everything. I have to like learn stuff again. But what helped me from the ideal business was this time when I'm evaluating stuff, remember the rate of business format? I told Liam about this as well. Now I can just look at something, any opportunity or any idea, in terms of all the 10, is this leverageable? Is this something that I believe in? Is this something? So I now have like a scorecard in my head that
Right.
can help me evaluate something so I don't waste time. So it's been very helpful.
Yeah, that's really good. Yeah, that makes sense. Being able to know what, I think it's, knowing what you want. It's also a little bit of knowing what you don't want,
Yeah.
because, we put a lot of attention on what we want, but maybe not what we shouldn't be doing. It's not necessarily on the right path. And so you just do it thinking, oh, it's all going to contribute to that. That's great, Hazel. That gives us a really good framework of where you're at and what stage of the journey you're at the moment, which is very cool. A lot of fun having you on board. Matt, talk to us, Matt.
Yeah, g'day, guys.
It's been a few years now as well.
Yeah.
How did you? Why? I remember right from the first time. I do remember meeting you for the first time. We had a coffee, and you weren't really. Right at that time, the thing that really attracted you to the way we were operating, we say, no, it works really well because it gives me some flexibility and work from home, and I can do that. So that was a big thing for you right from the onset, right from the get-go.
Yeah, it was really interesting. I actually was looking for that flexibility before I met you, Paul. And I actually tried to go to my boss at the time and I said, hey, I was working in corporate at that time. And I said, hey, look, I want to come down to 4 days. 4 days is going to suit me. And there was zero flexibility in that.
Right.
And so, unfortunately, I just said, well, look, if you're not going to do that, then I will leave. And I just left. And that suited me more. And then I decided I was going to take a little bit of time out. And then, funnily enough, COVID happened. And then everyone started taking time out. And then, funnily enough, everyone magically got the flexibility. All the corporate people, all of a sudden, were flexible, and you can do 4 days, and you can do work from home, and you can do all this nonsense that I pushed for literally 6 months before. So that was interesting. But yeah, I had a bit of an idea of what I wanted, and so I think one of the things that really attracted me is that I had a really loose understanding of what I was looking for and maybe some internal policy, which I would now classify as my ideal scene.
Mm-hmm.
But I didn't have any structure around it. I didn't have a roadmap or anything like that. And so when I was able to come to Invizbiz and start to be on a trajectory down that path where, hey, look, there is someone who's doing it in ways that, I feel like I can, in a path that I can go down, I was chuffed because I didn't think there was really many people in Australia, or let alone the world, that was still sort of doing that and had that sort of flexible arrangement with the way that they were set up. And then as I got into Invizbiz, I really started to grasp and understand, it's not just flexibility. There's all these other layers and all these other things that need to be in place in order to have this flexibility. And so that was really eye-opening to me. And one of the best things I found with Invizbiz. And then, from there, I was able to fit into that structure and just fully live, I guess, in my ideal scene and understand and start to create an ideal business, which has been amazing. So I think that was one of the interesting things when I first got to Invizbiz, and we sort of started having those chats, and that was about 4 years ago. And from there, it's I've had some really interesting insights being able to work with so many different businesses, and now I'm just at a stage where I want to give that back to all the people of the world, and that's a really cool thing. I think in terms of what I think makes an ideal business, I think everything that's already been said is 100%. But I'll just probably speak a little bit more on there needs to be some sort of homogenous or synergy between the ideal life and your ideal business, and that they're not a separate entity. So you can't just have an ideal business and then have a non-ideal life, essentially. You need to have both of them, and you probably need the ideal life first, because they both need to work within each other in order to achieve, the desired outcome. You can't be working, in a business 160 hours a week and then try and have an ideal life where you're all flexible and only work 4 hours, sort of thing. So they need to sync up. And then I think from there, what you get, something that maybe hasn't been directly talked about, is choice. And so the biggest thing that I realized with an ideal business is that an ideal business is actually a highly structured business. We talk about flexibility, and we talk about leverage and scalability and stepping back and not working much. But the only way you can do that is to actually have a very highly structured business that can take care of itself. And that structure then gives you the choice to make those decisions. It gives you the choice of who you're going to hire, of how much time you're going to spend on the business, of how, do you want to scale it, or do you just want to make it sustainable? And so that's really important. And then probably finally, one thing that hasn't been touched on as well is an ideal business for me is a sustainable business. So it's one that should go on picking away no matter what. It doesn't have these dramatic ups and downs where you're profitable one day and not profitable the next. It doesn't have a situation where if you left, then the business just goes down the hole. So it gives you that sort of flexibility in that, but it needs to be sustainable. And then it comes back to it. How does it get sustainable? Well, it gets sustainable through a lot of structure. So, and that's the space I like to play around in.
Yeah, right. No, that's a really good insight. I think there's always probably an incorrect perception of ideal business. It sounds great, Like I was trying to talk to this guy today. We were chatting about the business, and I was talking about, we do this, and people don't work on Friday, and they do that, and they do this, and so you get an impression like, what's everyone doing? Well, they're all fluffing around and doing things, but as you've sort of pointed out, it only really works within a fairly rigid framework. That's actually it's a bit of a dichotomy when you think about it. So you sort of have to have this freedom, flexibility, the ability to operate, quite loosely, and location, and so, but if you extended that out across the business and tried to run a business on that basis without having a framework, then it just doesn't work, So it's quite, and I think that's one of the reasons why it's a difficult thing to sort of get your head around, because they seem almost, like the opposite, which in essence they sort of are. They sort of are, and we struggle. One of the things that struggle to, as the business grows, it's hard to find people that can work within that framework. Either they're very, or they're very, so and because we haven't really been used to thinking and operating in that framework, and working in a place where people just trust you, just let you get on with what you're doing, which is, I know it sounds ridiculous, but that's a big issue in a lot of businesses. So Matt, from your perspective, you sort of, so what sort of things in your personal frame up, what does that look like? Like how does that look, the way that you live your life at the moment, and how does that, how do you dovetail that into your personal life and how that works?
Well, probably the key part for me was the flexibility. So I knew going into back in 2020, I knew that I wanted to spend as much time as possible with my son, because I just become a new dad. And I thought to myself, well, I'm never going to get that time again. And I wanted to, at the minimum, spend as much time for the first 3 years, because I know that scientifically 3 years, the first 3 years are pretty important. And I wanted to build that relationship. And I'm so glad I did. But the way that that turned out is, I think initially I had a very flexible arrangement. I was working approximately 24 hours or something like that a week. And those were hours that I got to essentially choose because it was, once again, based on outcomes. And that allowed me to develop a really sustainable, I guess, structure with my family. So me and my wife, where we got to spend just obscene amounts of time compared to anyone else raising this kid, which has been fantastic. And it's unfortunate, I think, that others don't necessarily get the opportunity for that. And there's multiple reasons why. But that's one of the things that has really stood out, is just allowing the opportunity for that. And I think it's super special because it's just time I will never get back. The other parts of this is probably to do around autonomy. So there are specific things you have to do generally in a day, especially in my role. There are meetings you have to attend, outcomes that need to get done, and statistics to look at, and all sorts of things. But there are certainly times when I'm probably not working my best necessarily at a given part of the day. And I think a lot of people can probably attest that you might either work better in the morning or better in the afternoon, or something's happened. You know, you've had a terrible night with your kid and you've been up all night at the hospital or something. And so what it allows me is some flexibility around how I choose to tackle the activities that I do within my day, and make sure that when I am tackling those activities, I am productive in those activities. And it's not just like you're on the clock for the sake of being on the clock. You're actually doing the activity and producing the outcomes. And so that level of autonomy mixed with the level of flexibility is probably the thing that an ideal business like Invizbiz has given me personally within my ideal life. Yeah, so that's probably the biggest thing. And it's coming back to sustainability. When you have that, right, and then you add purpose and you add a great team, right, and all these extras, it's just super sustainable. Yeah. This is probably the first time in my entire life. I'm approaching 40 at this stage, and I've had many different jobs, and I've had a couple of different businesses. This is one of the first times where it seems so effortlessly sustainable that you just don't think about doing anything else. And that's really special.
Wow, that's really insightful. It really puts some really clear, you know, how it sort of affected you and your family. You can sort of see that, where the seamlessness of it, you know. I think that's what you've talked about. And I think that's the challenge that so many of us as business owners do, is, you know, trying to juggle these two aspects of our life. Because people often say that, oh, leave the business at the door, and it's not really you, it's not the business. You know, it's a great idea, but in practical terms, it's almost impossible to achieve that sort of approach. You know, it's very, very difficult. Thanks for that, Matt. That was great to get some of your perspective and insights into what this is about. What I want to do is just share a little bit more information about Invizify, which I mentioned at the start of this podcast. As you know, this podcast is all about helping people build their ideal business. Now, if you want a structured plan and a process to do that, then you really need to check out Invizify. Invizify provides the end-to-end solution for someone to build, operate, and actually be able to extract from their business. And how does it do that? Well, it has a whole range of different components. Firstly, it's a philosophy and a strategy. Getting the philosophy and the strategy right at the beginning, and that really focuses on, why are you in business? What sort of life do you want to achieve? What's your ideal life look like? This is the absolute start point, and we call that the foundations. From there, we've got detailed training in every part of the business, not just training, but actually the tools, the framework, and the checklists, so that you can apply the training in a practical sense. So you can actually implement and have it make a difference to the way that you structure your business. What I've found over the years is there's lots of training and information on what you should do, but how you go about doing it is what's lacking. And that's what we really wanted to identify and create, was the how. So check out Invizify. If you're enjoying the podcast, you can find out how to apply this approach to you, your business, which will help you move towards an ideal life through creating an ideal business. Check out the link in the show notes. And the best part is it's free to get going and check out what's on offer. Do it today. I think I want to talk to Dante a little bit. We've got the same last name, so I think he's related to me. I'm pretty sure of that.
Yeah, somewhere down the line. Yeah, so I've just recently stepping into kind of a new role of head of public relations. But really, in simple terms, I'm kind of just the video guy. I'm the in-house filmmaker, editor, content creator. I think it started back in 2022. And it started at a very small scale, but at that time I had just moved to Melbourne for some studies, and really that is what sort of enabled me to just survive while I was over there. I think I was making, maybe I was doing 10-15 hours a week, and whatever it was kind of what I lived off. So that was really cool, and that was the start to see how it can kind of working from home and working around your schedule, because obviously, you know, I was running around doing all these assignments and filming, and I was partying and having fun, and the whole time I kind of made it all work around it. So that was really cool. And since then it's slowly amped up, and I've gotten more involved where I can. But I'd say I'm probably in a, you know, unique situation where I've sort of grown up around this whole thing my whole life. So, you know, I might have been a part of the team for the least amount of time, but I've also been around it the longest. And I'd say that was probably pretty surface level, but I saw when times were good and I saw when times were bad. It was pretty clear to see how Paul was feeling. I think it's very, very much transparent. And I reflect back on it a little bit, because personally, I'm a very risk averse person. I like comfort, and I don't really like putting myself out of my comfort zone. But just growing up around this sort of business mindset my whole life, it kind of screwed me a little bit, because I kind of got to a point I was like, I can't see myself working for someone in a normal working situation. And yeah, so I just kind of threw myself into some freelance stuff after I finished uni at film school. But even just my whole education kind of route was very alternative, because, you know, we've had a very unique situation. And yeah, so I guess when did I start? 2024. So last year, I kind of got into business personally for myself as a freelance, I would say freelance videographer. And it definitely wasn't something I would call an ideal business, in the sense that I kind of just jumped into it, not thinking much, not thinking it would really lead anywhere. And very quickly it got quite busy, and I found myself, you know, within a couple months, I had 4 or 5 clients on weekly or bi-weekly retainers. And very quickly I felt quite trapped, in the sense that, you know, it's just very constant, finish a shoot, go to the next one, go to the next. And so I was finding I'd had more money than I'd ever had before, and this was great, but I was also stressed just all the time. And so, yeah, like that was a great year. And then looking at how Invizbiz sort of incorporated into that, it was still, you know, I was still a part of the team. I was still working with Invizbiz, and it does seamlessly integrate. You know, it doesn't really matter how busy I got, because, you know, I have meetings on set days. And then aside from that, you're kind of able to just do work where you need, and you can stay up late or you can wake up early, and that's what I found. It's just Invizbiz is such a supportive environment to do whatever you need to do, whether you're with a team or you're doing your own personal stuff. And the team as well, everyone's always accessible and always happy to chat, and so that is also great. I feel like I'm in a good situation because I'm surrounded by people that have also been in my shoes, and I'm quite early in my business journey. So it is great to be surrounded by kind of people who have walked this path before. And so, yeah, I guess going into this year, I've kind of left my freelance thing to the side a bit, and now looking at constructing a business from the ground up. And I've taken a lot more time with it in hopes of making it, become an ideal business. But even just growing up around sort of seeing this business, there are some aspects of it that have just kind of been integrated into my life. Like if we're looking at sort of financial stability and allocation, I've always been really good with that. So, as soon as I had money coming in, it felt like everything was in control. And I've felt quite fortunate because I don't really know anyone my age who has that sort of control of their finances, which is pretty cool. But yeah, so that's kind of where we're at now.
It's really interesting. That's great, Dante. It's great to see that the journey, and you're still sort of rocking and rolling in different areas, which is very, very cool. The downside for Dante is he had to listen and watch all sorts of podcasts and videos, which
Yeah, I hang out with you all day.
I don't know if it's such a great thing. Look, maybe just open up a bit of a discussion now, because that gives you some perspective on what it means for the team. From my perspective, it's very similar. It's actually when you normalize what maybe is not so normal. Like to me, it's just, I don't think, people, I talk to friends and they go, oh God, you have this life and you do this and you do that. And I go, it's just normal though. It's actually just normal, and so when it becomes normal and you go, well, this is actually what it should look like, because you have to sort of leave behind what you think it should look like, because there's a lot of pressure on us to behave in a certain way, turn up on certain days, do certain things, not necessarily because they're the best way of doing them, but just that's the norms, that's the standards. I remember when I was working we had this manufacturing business, I had to, and I was doing the kids' day, which was Fridays, I'd take the kids off, and because they were around, Rob used to do a lot of the homeschooling stuff. I'd have to lie to people on Friday, just say, oh, I got meetings, and it's a big, because everyone would come in and say, oh, can we meet on Friday? And I'd go, oh no, I've got a full calendar on Friday. It was very uncomfortable saying I'm just hanging out with my kids, and this was in the, when was this? This was in the 90s, which is like, because you felt, I don't know, I was the MD of this business, so, it just felt like, I don't know, just sort of felt like everyone else is there doing shit, so maybe I should be there doing shit. It just felt like that. So
The guilt.
you keep, there was guilt, so you keep it. And then eventually I went, no, that's fine. I'm just telling everyone. I just blocked it out, and it took a while to become comfortable with that, which is really interesting. So I just want to ask a question or start a bit of a discussion around why is it though? We all know business owners. We've all been in business. We all dealt with lots of business owners. So why is it that it's not that common? What is it about the way that the conventional way of growing and running and operating businesses? Why is it not that common? It seems like we talked about how we see it and it's impactful for us. But if it makes so much sense, why is it not that common? I'm like, I don't know. I know business, and there are a lot of business owners, and they have some, but there seems to be a belief that's in place, and you said that before, Liam, you have to change a belief that I can't really achieve outcomes or this or that if I'm not running like this, if I'm not operating in a particular way. But why is it? What stops business owners or other people really sort of thinking about it and looking at how they can shape it? Because as we've worked out, it's not difficult you know, it's not like something that's like, oh, this is rocket science. It's a process, and you've got to work with it. It takes a bit of time. I think there's an element of time, but it'd just be interesting to hear other people's thoughts around that. Why is it not so common? Why don't you just come across businesses all the time like, oh yeah, no, we do this, and there's flexibility here and there. They do exist. I mean, clearly these businesses exist out there, but they're still, from my experience, they're still a minority. They're not a common business, you know.
From my point of view, some of the initial points, the way that I came up was what I would consider a very standard way, at least within Australia and probably most Western countries, is that I went to school, I went to university, I took business, so I learned about business and management and marketing and those sort of things. And then they sort of kick you out into the real world, and then go into, a lot of it at the time, it's like larger corporations and things like that. And you learn that this is the way that everyone does it because everyone's always has done it this way. And so when you're looking at just general examples, that's sort of all the knowledge that you have, and that's what you sort of, or the environment that you've been brought up in. I think that's one part of it. And I think the second part of it is, and this is probably more to do with small business, the small to medium enterprise, is that a lot of people, when they do start their own businesses, they get into it for money. And as we've already mentioned, they just start working harder and harder and harder on the business. And what ends up happening is, one, they don't have the knowledge, but two, they also don't have the time. So they're working in their business, and they're not working on their business because they haven't given themselves the space to necessarily do that, to then start making those adjustments that would make sense to us. Because when we are looking at a business, we already have the knowledge. And so the first thing we do is we just go, well, you should do it this way, because that's the way, you know, that's going to align with what your ideal business and ideal scene is. But for most business owners, they don't have that knowledge. And then they don't have the time to actually start to work on that, even if they did have a roadmap. So I think those are probably some of my key takeaways from working with businesses and just my own upbringing.
No, that's very interesting. That's true. It's true. That is there's definitely a need to change thinking, isn't there? You know, and it's one of the things that I guess we've been struggling with a little bit, is that because people aren't necessarily looking for it, it's more of a thing that's missing, right? It's a missing thing, as opposed to something that's bad. It's just missing, you know. And when things are missing, it's not, maybe not as tangible to understand what that might look like, you know. And if any of us, you know, as you know, when you build a business, you sort of have a particular way of operating. You do certain things, and now look, it's necessary, and we do shit we don't like, and that's just the nature of business. It's not really sustainable. You can't keep doing that forever, you know. It just doesn't work like that. And I think there's a lot, you know, one of the things that I've seen is there's a lot of it's like a sunk cost idea, you know. Like, I've been running a business and I've been working my bum off, and I do my 60 hours a week, and that's actually what's gotten me here, you know. And so then, you know, to change tact and go, well, maybe I don't need to work 60 hours a week. Maybe I can, you know, change. Maybe I can stop doing, I don't need to do some of these things. That's something that's different to the way things have been going, which sort of makes people uncomfortable, because, you know, that's how I've gotten here. So why would I change that? You know, it's one of those things, you know, not realizing that it's not necessarily why you've gotten there. It might have contributed, but there is that sort of an element. And I think the problem now we also have with social media is that, you know, you can turn up, you know, do one thing and boom, you know, like, it's almost like you don't really. So we've gone from this, you know, really you got to work hard and do all these things and apply yourself, to like, you pretty much don't have to do anything. You know, it's like, because that's, I mean, if you look at social media, you know, it's you know, it comes up all the time. I'm supposed to do that, and then you hear these stories and that. So now it's created this sort of a belief framework that you can just, you know, it's actually really simple. You know, you just come up with one thing and do this and do that. So it's sort of yeah, it's quite interesting how that sort of changed.
I think also it's not just about people who don't know what they don't know, because there's obviously a blind spot there.
Yeah.
But it takes a very, very special sort of person to actively seek knowledge into the unknown when they don't know what they don't know.
Yeah. Right.
And if you're on this podcast or if you're doing, you're probably already actively seeking that information. So you're probably a special person. But most people are not. And the time when they do go to seek that information is only at the very end of the road, when they have a million problems and they've already been burnt, and then they finally hit rock bottom and they say, this is not working. Now I need information.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of people are not looking for that information early on.
Yeah, that's a great observation. It's actually true. It's difficult, it's a lot easier. Sorry, Hazel, go on.
I think there's also this messaging everywhere that you should be suffering, right? You should be suffering. You should be working hard. You should be suffering.
Right.
There's this messaging that I'm hearing everywhere that a real business owner, real entrepreneur, you have to have a hard time. You have to be staying up late nights. You have to sacrifice your family. You have to sacrifice your friends. You have to sacrifice your health. You got to sacrifice your sleep. Because if you're not doing that, you're not a real business owner. That's what I've been hearing everywhere, and it's just so annoying. And then they get sick, and then they wonder, what's going on? Suddenly. So yeah, I've seen so many, like when I was starting, I've met some young guns, some young people, hungry, thirsty, and they're like, I'm gonna be a business owner. And then they're all like that. Hustle, got no time for friends, got no time for this. And then I think years later, suddenly they're all talking about health. And like there was this one guy who posted something happened to him health-wise, something really bad. I think some aneurysm or something, but it was really bad. It's because he was working a lot. Like this guy is known in our circles as someone who's a true workaholic. And then suddenly something happened to his health. And suddenly the vision changed. And so I think in the beginning, like when all of the messaging is about, if you're a real business owner, you should be killing yourself to get to this point. And if you're starting to feel comfortable, then maybe it's not, you're not working hard enough. So in like talking with you guys about the ideal business, where, for example, you said, Paul, that in the beginning, you really should be grinding to build it to a certain point, but it shouldn't be life like forever. You're grinding because you want to take from A to B. And then once it's there, you're going to look at different benchmarks now. But that's not, at least from the circles that I've worked in, that's not what I've heard. It's like you have to be working forever,
Yeah, right. So it's a never-ending sort of cycle. Yeah. I think it's sort of understanding, and you only do that through building, a business over time, and maybe being in businesses that aren't that great. That there's seasons, isn't there? There's sort of seasons, and a perspective of, because when you look at your builder business, it's an age thing to a degree. Like when you're younger, the amount of, met some of your friends, Hazel, and they go, oh, I've left it too late. And like, how old are you? 24. I'm like, yeah, okay. I don't think you've left it too late. It's like there's this to miss out, or I've got to be moving. I don't know where that comes from, whether it's social media or
social media, definitely.
It probably is, So, but when you have a perspective of like, all right, you're 25 or you're 30, and you go, well, you could sort of have a roadmap for the next 10 years where you could have it nailed down within 10 years. But 10 years seems like a really long time, like when you're there, you're like 10 years. But, it's a different way of thinking where your life, your health, your family, your relationships, you want to bring them along. You don't want to lose what you've got as part of the journey. And that's difficult, because entrepreneurial people just throw themselves into it, tend to be workaholics, and they go and they're wired for it, that's what happens, that's what I'm like, so you throw yourself into it. And if you don't have a bit of a framework for, because it's if I look at it, if I talk to my kids and stuff, they just say, you're just off the planet, you're doing this, you're doing that. Well, it's not like I'm sitting around reading a book, so you know, but that's not my ideal life, you know. So, but at the same time, having been able to spend time on things that I like, with people that I like, in places that I like, doing whatever it is that I like, and that's the same with everyone. And we're all wired differently, but I think not seeing that as part of the framework, it's possible. It's actually possible, you know. And I think that's the challenge. It is a challenge, and so trying to, you know, because if you said, oh, you know, it's really easy to pitch. Well, we'll teach you how to scale your business from 0 to 10 million in 5 years and work 3 hours a week. You know, everyone goes, oh, hallelujah. You know, it sounds great, but you know, it's a, you know, it's this process that you've got to put things into place, and it's just not that sexy. I mean, that's the thing about it. It's just not that sexy.
Yeah,
it's,
yeah.
I mean, I got to work. Yeah. Do you like writing? Yeah, no. Well, yeah, you got to write procedures. You know, do you like spreadsheets? Yeah, we need spreadsheets and graphs. Like, you know, so it's just not that sexy. You know, so you can't. It's a hard thing to sort of communicate to people, but you know, it's what we talked about before. The more frameworks and structure that you have, the only way to freedom happens to be through frameworks and structures and rigidity that will enable freedom. And that's, I remember when I had that realization, it was like, oh God, you know, man, I have to do all that to get to here, where, you know, because it feels a bit weird, you know. I think that's been the sort of the challenge, because we've worked with other business owners, and they either want to do nothing and be there like I'm in the space now, you know, or they're working, you know, and the time thing, I think, was the big thing that's come up in the conversation. If you don't create space or time to, you know, to work on it and to try to evolve it and to try to move towards changing, because it is a change process, then it's almost impossible, really. It's impossible to do, you know. So so that's been an interesting shift. So, you know, obviously, you know, from our perspective as Invizbiz, we really, you know, passionate about working with businesses to help, you know, successful business owners who are at a point where they want more out of life necessarily, and trying to work out. It is a transformational journey where it starts with personal transformation at your own personal level and changing your thinking. You know, I remember I was sitting here, one of the most striking things was Jared, a good friend of mine, he's got a, you know, large property management business, you know, and you know, he was going, oh, I'm doing this, I'm doing that, I'm going to buy, and he's buying cleaning businesses and doing this, and he's all over, and he's got, and I remember I sat down with him on the whiteboard, and I asked him, I just said to him, okay, let's not talk about the business. He wanted to talk about strategy and yada yada and blah blah blah. And I said, I'm just going to ask you a few questions. I said, so tell me, why did you go into business? It was a really simple question. He goes, what do you mean? I said, why did you go into business? And he just went dead quiet. I'm like, why did you go into business? And you could see the look on his face was changing, because he was starting to piece together. I didn't say anything, but he sort of, in his head, he was going, oh, you know, yeah. And he was in his brain, he was like processing it and going, I'm like, you know, I said, so let's write them up, you know. So I got him to verbalize, you know. And it's all, I mean, the reality is it's the same for, you know, everyone. Not everyone, but, you know, I want to make money. What do you want to make money? No one really necessarily loves the coin, you know, but I want to spend time with people I love. I want to spend time with my kids. I want to be able to travel, blah, 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 blah. And it's like and then you sort of look at it, hey, I spend time with my relation, make sure my wife, and then you go, well, okay, how's it going? It's like he was just depressed. He just looked at it and went, and he'd been in business 10 years. He's a successful business guy. And so it was, and he has high level of awareness, you know. He's a very smart guy. He's really personable, very intelligent, is a great business owner, very switched on. But it just was not in his way of thinking, you know. It was almost like you get that at the other end, you know. Oh, you sell it, or you do this, or you do that. But it wasn't actually, and we had lots of conversations around things that, you know, an office. I said, do you need an office? Oh, yeah, we need an office. You know, he doesn't have an office now. He just has a small place where they hotspot, you know. You know, do your property managers need to come in the office? What's that about? Oh, yeah, they need to come in. And they don't anymore now, you know. they sort of work from home and stay within their zone. So there's been things but it was that same concept that he'd achieved a lot of success through this way of operating and running his business, even though it wasn't necessarily working for him, because he had that level of stress all the time and this and that, and he just started taking, days off with his kids. He says, I don't work this day and that day. They're off. Oh, well, that's great. And, what did he see? No impact on the business, because it was. So it's interesting. So these are intelligent people that, know how to run and grow businesses, but still maybe, it's just we're just not looking for it. I guess that's the thing. And then it sets you on a path when you start thinking, maybe there is a different way. That's a different way of approaching this. So yeah, we're all pretty passionate about it. Sorry, Dante, what were you saying, mate?
I was saying, and that is Invizbiz, the different way.
Yeah, it is. It's sort of what we're really aiming to do is just share a bit of it. It is a philosophy, and I was talking to someone the other day about it. It is a framework. We don't really talk about it as a framework or as a system or as a program, but it actually is, because there's all these things and there's a whole bunch of tools that come with it. But it's also probably first and foremost a philosophy. It's actually a philosophy that you either are interested in or you're not. If you're really just focused on money and optimizing the money, and you're not really, that's your gig and that's your space, that's where you're at the moment, and that's fine, then it's not really going to resonate with you. If you're at a space where you're going, well, I've sort of done some of that stuff, I now need to work out how this sort of works. Because how many people do we know, like, I'm turning 60 this year, so everyone's sort of, people been working and they're all retiring, and the idea of retiring is an interesting, what's the word retiring mean? What does that mean when people say they're retiring? What does it mean? People go, I'm retiring.
Becoming professionally unemployed.
Yeah. But what defines, it's an interesting question. What defines when someone is retired? What is it?
Like they're just not working anymore, right? Like quote unquote unwork. Like usually it's salary driven, but it could be your individual business. Yeah. And they're just not working in it anymore.
Yeah. So typically, but a big thing is that often is that the money I was getting from the activity isn't the same. I have to get the money from somewhere else. So you still need money to live, obviously, if you're retired, so it's an interesting, because then someone said to me, oh, you look like you're retired. I go, what was that? And he goes, well, you do all the things a retired person would do. I go, well, what's the retirement? You travel all the time. You don't seem to do this and blah, blah, blah. The difference is when you build an ideal business and your income is not related to your activity, then it all gets a little bit blurry, doesn't it? So if I don't have to be in a particular location and I don't have to do a certain activity, and so what's the line between, in that scenario, what does it look like to be retired? Like are you still working? Yeah. Do you still get the same income whether you work or not, or whether yeah, okay. And you might just choose to spend your time differently. It's the idea of retirement where there's a hard line, because that in Australia, when you turn 60, you can sort of start taking your superannuation or your money. And so, I was at a party with a bunch of guys I've worked in Singapore with, 30 years ago, more than 30 years ago. They're retiring. Like, and I'm like, so right. So what happens now? Oh, yeah. So it was actually working offshore or doing this or doing that, and now they're retiring. Which is an interesting, and it doesn't really enter my realm of thinking, because you want something to end, don't you? The reason you want to retire is like that it'd just be nice if that stopped, and then I can just move on to the next phase. But you're 60 years old, it's not. So I think that's the idea of hanging out, and those windows. And you talked about that, Matt, before with your kids. I had those realizations as well. You've got these windows of opportunity that exists with your family, your parents, your kids. Those windows close. They're just not there. They close. I remember talking to people who had young kids, and I said, you need to spend time with your kids. And they're like, oh, no, I'm just about there. I've got this sorted. Don't get the business to this level. Oh, yeah, I know, but they're going to be 13. They don't even know who you are. They're not even going to want to talk to you, So your idea of what your relationship is going to be like is going to change. So there's all these windows that, you're sort of like on a train and you're moving along a track, and there's these chunk, 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 and they don't, once you pass them by, they're gone. They're just gone. Things like, spending time with your kids when they're small, gone, non-recoverable. Relationship stuff, gone, non-recoverable. Well, none of this stuff's recoverable. It's really, and so if you have that perspective, you would, really think a little bit more about, trying to be micro-focused on one thing all the time might not necessarily be the most ideal way to operate, So yes, it is interesting. It is interesting. All right. Well, thanks everyone for, plugging in, and, it was nice to hear the perspective of the team and what drives you guys as individuals, as business owners, and as players in the game. It's been great. Great to see those perspectives. And you can probably pick, as someone listening to this podcast, there's a bit of an alignment, and I think that's an important thing. There's a bit of an alignment in what we want in life. Forget about business, but what we want in life and what we want our life to look like, our relationships to look like, there's an alignment. And then when you are surrounded by people that have that alignment, then it sort of keeps you on course, which is really important, and it's quite hard if you're trying to operate like this and you're working in an environment or that's not like that, then it makes it very difficult because the guilt piles up and people are questioning, why aren't you there? Why didn't you, all that sort of stuff. So I think it's been fantastic to get the perspective of you guys. Thanks for plugging in and sharing some of your story with us. And thanks everyone for listening to this episode, and look forward to catching up with you at the 101st podcast at some point in the future. Thank you, Aim. Ciao, ciao. If you enjoyed today's podcast, then I recommend for you to check something out. I've written a book called Building Your Ideal Business, Live Your Ideal Life. So much of the content in this podcast has sort of come from the framework of that book, and also the Invizbiz platform, which I've mentioned before. Much of that content has come from this book as well. So if you've enjoyed the podcast and you want to find out more, please check it out. Look in the show notes. It's currently available on Amazon, and let me know what you think.